Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Today on this episode of Conversations, we're joined with the great Adam Brazeal, who is working with Exponent Energy and founder of Oilfield Completion Solutions. So we have a lot to cover. We can riff on a lot of different topics, but I'll turn it over to him, introduce what he's working on, some of the cool things that he's doing, and then we'll get into some of the fun energy world stuff.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate the kind introduction. I am currently working field operations for Exponent Energy. We move a couple million a day in gas through the city of Tulsa and try to make a few things happen on the natural gas side. But the reason I wanted to talk to you today, Mr. Rossano, is you just got so much wealth of information about everything that I believe that there is some value to the listener to help find out why the things that you say matter. I know we were talking a little bit off mic that you started at Morgan Stanley, and we're just curious to know how do you get started in this space to where you end up counting frac spreads every week?
Yeah, so I started at Morgan Stanley, and my background is FX rates commodities. So for us, we were always agnostic to the commodity. It just so happened where I've traded or invested in everything from cotton and cocoa to grains to soy crush. And then when it came down to figuring out the macro direction and the political nature of things, what is better than oil? And oil is such a pivotal component to the underlying world in general. And when you think about what is more macro than FX and rates, well, if you understand FX and rates, you have to understand a little bit at least about what is happening in oil, what is happening in that world in general. And I just ended up loving, the energy space, and I used that to kind of knock down the silos. And I did everything across the where the molecule goes. So my goal was to follow the molecule. I wanted to follow it from the E&P to the midstream, to the refiner, to the ship, and essentially where it ends up in either the Starbucks cup that you're holding in your hand or the heat that you use in your home. And I wanted to follow the molecule all the way through and all of the ebbs and flows that can come with it. Let's put it that way.
Well said indeed, sir. So if you're looking at the macro for the oilfield space in the United States, we have a lot of argument about whether or not production is going to fall. And I think you and I are both of the same mindset that without the number of rigs and frac spreads that are currently working, we're looking for a pretty steep decline, which is everyone's forecasting the price of oil shooting through the roof by the end of the summer. I don't think everyone's fully appreciating is that 30% of the Americans haven't had the income to go be able to afford high energy prices at the same time when food prices are shooting through the roof. What do you think that is being overlooked right now by this current administration?
I think right now it's really inflation. Inflation is going to be the killer when you consider how hot the market is running right now. And I think, as you said, when you look at these individuals that haven't seen their wages increase, and realistically, people haven't seen their wages increase in almost 10 years now. And so we're seeing this perpetual movement in commodities. And like you talked about with crude, the problem with crude, it's structurally oversupplied, and there's a lot of oil that is held behind a wall, whether it be political with OPEC or just behind the wellhead as we see activity increase in the U.S. But there's going to see, when you look at other components like grains and food, and then you go into the raw material world, there's structural shortfalls, and the cash market and the physical market is marrying pretty closely, if not driving, where the paper market is trading. And I think those are going to be the biggest issues when we look at how does the consumer respond in a post-COVID world.
Absolutely. I think that I saw an article this morning. The farmers in Iowa were having a boon, and they just couldn't believe how great it was that the prices they're getting for their bushels. The fact of the matter is the guy that has to buy that at the end of the line is still struggling. And there's no, what I would say, reasonable thought or reasonable consideration that these guys are going to be, we're going to have food fights in the middle of the United States. And from the crude molecules that we produce, as they get more expensive, the poor get hurt more. And it just feels like that this discussion is being overlooked with the fact that we're heating the planet up. I'm concerned that if this world doesn't heat up a little bit more, we're not going to be able to have the food to feed 8 billion people.
And that's what we're seeing more and more when you look at just what has happened over the last, really since 2014, we've seen a big increase in food insecurity. And food insecurity is measured in a lot of different ways. But when you start looking at the issues, and this is more of a global issue because the U.S. has been gifted with very healthy farmlands. And when you think about the bumper crops we've had versus where it's actually going, that is the biggest issue. But now we have significant shortfalls that have been created from, armyworms, locusts, and now this shifting world of droughts and floods, both on a bigger severity that is impacting throughput. And you're seeing these yields drop, you're seeing supply drop, just as you're seeing demand continue to drive higher, as you said, with 8 billion people. When we're just seeing this pressure, which is just going to continue to drive up prices as we put food into our gas tanks, and diesel tanks, which is a completely separate entity that we could get into.
I'm trying to avoid the rabbit hole, but if we need to go there, it will make an interesting podcast for sure. What are you focused on in, let's just say, the next year to position yourself for the potential? If we're going to go down the green route, it's a lot of things have to change in a hurry, and it feels very tribal. Those of us here in the flyover states versus the coasts. And that's the question is, do the people in New York City really think we're bad people for producing oil and gas that powers 70% of the United States right now?
Well, I think there's the misconception, and it was one of the reasons why we wanted to do the podcast. We wanted to bring people like yourself on, is to talk about what happens at the wellhead. Because I think there is this, oh, well, it's so dirty. It's like, well, but is it? What is dirty about fracking? What is the detriment that we're actually causing? And they're like, well, it leaks into the water table. I'm like, all right, well, let's think about that. So what is that? If you have and you'll talk about this, I'm sure, if you think about it, if you have a broken casing going down the well, well, you're going to lose pressure. So you don't want that either, because that's going to be a detriment to you, because you're just not going to be able to recover what you're supposed to. So you're going to want to avoid that, just like you don't want to pollute the environment in general. Then you look at the different capacity at the top side when you have the separation pools and what can be done to make sure that are they still in pools? What kind of plastic are they lined with? Can we do it in tanks instead? What is the cost of tanks versus pools? Nobody's going out there, giggling to themselves like we're going out to pollute, to purposely pollute the environment. We're going out there to find a very efficient, very, let's be fair, carbon reducing molecule. When we think about, like, as you talked about, natural gas, it creates the affordability and the efficiency that we need, especially when you think about the industrial movements and the needs of giving people their heat and their normal movements at all income levels. Let's put it that way. Because somebody living in a mansion, if their gas goes from where are we at Henry Hub right now? If gas goes from 289 to 389, they'll just kind of shrug and say, oh, well, that kind of sucks. But somebody who's living paycheck to paycheck, that's a real number.
Absolutely, it's a real number. And it's affecting the ones that are arguing about whether or not we should do it the most. And it's like, I want to be able to help control the conversation. We have a financial incentive. We have an environmental incentive to make sure that everything we do is to the best standards. The United States is a leader, regardless of all what the media will tell you, in keeping our environment safe. We have people that will actually run around and double check that when we say we do something, they will ensure it was actually executed on. And a lot of people that from the news stories I've seen is that no, we're just a wanton wasteland and we just let it run down the river and pick it up at the end. That's not the case at all. We have what I would consider aged infrastructure, especially in Northeast Oklahoma. We drilled our first well here in 1907, I believe. I live 600 feet from a producing oil well that's only 150 foot deep. The Mississippi line outcrops right here. It's just how the geology in the world was laid. And yes, natural gas vents up naturally. There was no fracking involved in that. It's just you don't know other than what the narrative in the school books will teach you. But what I'd like to make sure and get it out there is that we are committed to the environment. There is a financial, being the biggest driver, reason to protect this asset that we have, and then also to be able to provide all the good things that come from it. All the petroleum products we use every day, regardless of what they want to say, and the rare earth minerals that we need to make the batteries to cover everybody's cell phone in the United States. There's currently not a nickel mine large enough in the United States to cover all the cell phones we use. So it does take a global population, everybody working together to make all these things come available to us at a reasonable rate. And I think that was one thing that is missed in this discussion is that no matter how bad we think we've done in the past, we have to look to the future and move forward, and we stop pointing fingers at the other side that they're not on my team. And if you want to dive into social media and how I feel like everybody is getting divided into teams, that could be another discussion as well.
Well, I think you bring up some good points, especially when you start breaking down, what is the solution? What is the right solution? And the one thing that we've learned time and time again, it's a basket approach. There is never going to be a one size fits all. Is solar wind bad? No. Does it have its place? Absolutely. Is it going to be base load? No. And that is going to be the biggest crux of the conversation. So we have to make sure that we have the sustainability and the efficiency, but at the same time, the reliability. You're not going to build a facility here if you're unsure that the electricity is going to turn on 30 or 70% of the time. You need consistency on, I'm going to have power 99.9% of the time outside of maybe a rogue tornado or storm that takes down my power for which at its worst will be measured in days, but never in weeks, or most likely measured in hours. These are things that need to be considered when we're thinking about what needs to be addressed. And that's why, like, when we can go through what happened during the Texas freeze off and what kind of chaos you dealt with to try to get that gas out of the ground, we can see what happens when there is no gas, and what happens to the system when you have peakers or natural gas interruptible contracts being interrupted, and what that actually looks like when you have a significant rolling shortfall of natural gas.
Absolutely. So I spent 11 years in oilfield service. Give me the best quality for the least amount of money. That is what OFS should stand for. And the reality is that these guys, we are doing the best we can for the minimum amount of money. We sent a guy to the moon on the cheapest contract. That was a line from Armageddon.
So when you're doing go through kind of what you do from when you show up at the well, and what is the process? So you drilled the rig has left, you've drilled the well. Now what? Like, what is step one to the end of that process to make sure that you do things right, you do things economic, but what does that process look like? Because let's understand, what is fracking? What is completing a well? How is that done? And then how is that done on an environmental level?
So, great question. From the time, you want to go from the time it's drilled?
Sure. So
once the well has been drilled, the majority of our basins, we already have the infrastructure in place to move the liquids, to move the gas. from the time we take over possession of that wellbore, we bring in our specific equipment, our frac equipment. We stab on a wellhead. We stab on all of our other connections that we need to make sure that we can get water and sand downhole. The majority of, especially this day and age, we're sending water and and basically river sand at this point down a piece of 5.5-inch tubing, which is just steel casing and it's threaded together just like you would. Think of a very long straw that got shoved down into the earth in between a sandwich layers of rock. A very good follow for your listeners is De La Rosa on Twitter, and he is actually one of the wireline engineers, and he's taken the time to educate. This is what a wireline gun looks like. This is how we'll take this set of guns and we'll run it down the hole. And I imagine that the woke parade's going to come after. We can't have these wireline guns. There shouldn't be guns in the oil field. And they go down and they perforate the casing. And then we'll bring our frac pumps online, and we'll start moving fluid downhole, and then that fluid will carry sand. That fluid is water. And I think 80% of it now is produced water. It was water that was already in formation. So historically, that hasn't been the case. And then usually a little bit of bleach just to kill the bacteria, because microbes are real. And if we don't treat the contaminants downhole, we're going to get H2S back to the surface.
Now, we will.
But once we've...
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so once we've got the wellbore fracked, we've got midstream either standing by or already connected. We'll either hook it into a pipeline or put it into a tank. All those tanks are sealed, especially on the new work. There was some, back in early 60s when we didn't fully know the effect of what produced water could do. We had open air pits. We used to let our drill cuttings and runoff just go straight into a creek, and dilution is the solution. We wait for it to rain, and then you wouldn't know anything had happened there other than the small wellhead that sticks out of the ground. A lot of people like to drive by, and there's been some recent discussion about what a wellhead should look like in an actively producing well. The problem is temperature variation at the surface. It's 175 degrees downhole, and you bring it back to the surface where it's 80, you're going to get condensate. Right. But the wellhead will be black because we use grease and oil to help trap the molecules. Right. We are the number one most concerned industry about methane emissions because it's worth a lot more to us selling it to the consumer. So we have a huge incentive to make sure that we are monitoring our situation, keeping tabs on where our molecules are going to go, and then putting them in the pipeline so that they can be used and for future generations.
Now, when you look at, just in terms of what we've seen, I mean, it's very easy to see a rig coming on, the speed in which they've operated. And that was really kind of the low-hanging fruit. And we saw a lot of rig efficiencies happen, what felt like almost overnight in terms of the speed in which they could operate and drill effectively, stay in zone, and then move on to the next well. And now it seems like we've moved to downhole. What kind of efficiencies have you seen, say, over the last 2-3 years that have really kind of changed the game in terms of not only maybe recoveries, but also time to market?
Absolutely. So specifically in the last 36 months, when I first started, we had to have the absolute perfect chemistry. We had to have the exact right fluid for what we knew the rock was able to give up. And we had to have a perfect sand. A lot of times ceramic, bauxites, northern white monocrystalline sand that was imported. And the biggest thing that we've discovered in the last 36 months is that time value of money, we just have to be close enough to make it more effective. More sand doesn't always equal a better well. It took a while for us to figure that out as well. And there is a group of some of the best engineers on the planet. They have got forced in the last 36 months onto a spreadsheet. This commodity is only worth X. How fast can you get it? What's my velocity of petroleum coming out of the hole? And what does our economics look like at 3 different benchmarks? Well, you roll it back up to the capital that funded the madness, and that was the biggest change in the industry in the last since 2017 is that absolute cheap financing in pursuit of growth,
Right.
which is how we got us to where we did in April 2020 with a big old negative number. And so without a little bit of hubris, we did it to ourselves. We know once all the COVID, one man was warning us about the COVID repercussions, but
So everyone thought I was crazy. Everyone thought I was crazy.
Everyone thought that's just how I came to meet you, is because I was sitting around being quarantined in my house looking for entertainment. And I was like, who's this goofball trying to predict what a frac spread does? I worked in frac for 10 years. What is this? Who does this guy think he is? And then you've taught me a lot, Mr. Fasano, which I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I don't think my opinion matters.
Of course it does. That's why we're here.
You've given me the opportunity to tell the world differently.
Absolutely. Well, and that's when we look at, as you said, before, river sand, or the sand compositions have adjusted, things have shifted a bit. Has that impacted recoveries? Like, was it something where, okay, well, instead of using white sand, I can use this brown sand, and I might give up a little bit, but my speed to market? Or have you found that it's really not that detrimental to total recoveries, but maybe there's going to be something on the decline curve on the back end? What have you seen so far, and what are you guys expecting when you're thinking about decline curves over the longer term?
So when we're looking at the EURs, I would say the inventory we're drilling today was tier 3 5 years ago, and now it's our tier 1 premier locations, and that the biggest change is that we're finally figuring out the spacing. That it's a lot easier to move gas molecule than it is a liquid molecule, and so you're trying to figure out the correct optimal. To quote more drilling, the best cube you can get to maximize the recovery. Right. If you look at on shale profile, you can see the actual production numbers, not based on what the company tells you it was, but how much they're actually selling on a per well basis. So everything is headed in the right direction. Even though this is tier 3 acreage, we're still getting tier 1 results in some areas. Now there's still some. I feel like 2020 was the tail end of the 2014 $140 oil. Right. We've known the oil was there. How quickly can you get it out, and how efficiently can you get it out so that we can maximize the asset class? Now we as an industry, we had to learn the hard way that the more straws you shove in the cup, the quicker the cup's going to be drained. And I feel like that's the biggest change from 17 until now. Is that we've got the recipe pretty well dialed in. Is there more improvement for efficiencies? Like, can we start fracturing with CO2, which is the way the world looks to, we need to capture it. No better way than to liquidize it and shut it down whole. Right. 15,000 foot TBD. I haven't seen any major companies coming out with that, but that really does need to be part of the discussion. Is how do we efficiently and cheaply liquidize the carbon dioxide, and then let's go back out to the Permian, where I think we've only recovered maybe 5 to 10% on a per well basis of what the total recoverable oil is, and carbon dioxide will help that lift. We re-energize a dead rock, so. I think that's where the future was headed. We tried a lot of this in the 70s. We tried a lot of this in the 80s. This is before we turned to horizontal and before we had well control on both sides of the field. So the biggest upcoming opportunity for the United States oil and gas is enhanced oil recovery. I know Oxy talks about it quite a bit, and that they're going to be a carbon capture company. But let's just be real. We still want that sweet liquid crude coming out of the ground. And if I can reflate the balloon just enough to enhance recovery a little bit, It's real dollars. It's real helping people. You're keeping people in New York warm.
Right. I think it was Halliburton. They used to use this number. I think it was back in 16 and 17. Was if you could increase recoveries by 1%, that provides 2 years of oil supply. This is a global thing. If you increase just oil recoveries by 1% globally, like you just covered oil demand for 2 years. And when you think about like when you start talking about the Permian, I always used to like to joke because back in 14, 15, everyone used to say, "Oh, there hasn't been a big oil discovery in over a decade." It's like, well, I know that the Permian isn't newly discovered, but isn't it kind of rediscovered based on what we just found? And then if you think about taking it to the next level, how much of that trapped oil can really get recovered? How much of it is maybe lost forever, but we've continued to find new, ingenious ways to get it out. It started back in the 40s when we actually used a nuke to frack just to see what happened. And clearly we learned that we don't need nuclear equipment to frack a well. And then, you think about Pennsylvania in the 1800s using just a stick of dynamite to create flow. So there's something to be said about, the efficiencies that have been gained between these different time periods. But when you think about some of the next stages, like when you talked about natural gas versus liquids, and then oil's harder to move than liquids is harder to move. And it's just on a molecular level. Some things like to go from that, low pressure to high pressure in different ways and difficulties. And we've found that choke point where if you choke back a well, you can maintain some of the integrity downhole, and you can recover some of those bigger liquids, bigger molecules that don't like to move. I mean, how has that changed? Like, are you seeing more of that where getting the recipe kind of right and then making the adjustments downhole with choke backs and maintaining pressure? Can you kind of walk through that a bit?
So yeah, absolutely. It's happening more in practice today than it was when I was actively sitting on the frac jobs, but we could control the pressure to allow. Think about it: you're inflating the balloon. You want to keep the balloon open so that the oil can find the hallways, and the oil's locked in the rooms. The frac is opening the doors to the rooms down a long hallway. Think of the hallway as the wellbore. Right. If we can control the pressure at the downhole level, we allow our liquid molecules to come back in easier. Right. We're doing a lot of things with downhole valves. We're finding the fastest isn't always the best. And I think that was a time and experimenting, but you're also looking at companies that were so debt-ridden, they had to get as much oil now as they could to be able to cover debt service. So, and you look at it from a business point, the number of rigs is proportionate to the amount of interest being paid by the industry. And I think that has been the biggest lesson in 2020 is when the tide goes out, you find out who's skinny dipping. Right. And they were having to drill so fast that it was more about cash flow than it ever was about ultimate recovery. And I believe that, we needed this transition in the industry. We needed to flush out a lot of stop chasing the dollar. Let's actually do what's best for the environment. EOG's probably the champion of this, from a shaleco operator, not a major. Chevron and Phillips, those guys, they are slow, methodical. They have a team of engineers that are capable of looking into it and finding out the best way to manage it. And then compression from, if a lot of what everybody knows is stripper wells or sub-prime wells, they were really good back in the 80s, but they're still flowing today. Moving compression in and out of the midstream, what's the best way to pull those pressures off and get that fluid off the reservoir so the gas can flow? Right. A lot of that is still being with big data, and a lot of the companies that are being formed now is that they are looking at pressure optimization of the rock so that they can get the best ultimate recovery for the pipeline. Right. How do we work together in tandem to help lift each other up? And then we've been so siloed. That's one thing 2020 did bring about, is that we were able to work with our midstream partner and said, hey, I know what we agreed to, but we can either adjust this agreement now or we can both go bankrupt. Right. Totally up to you. And I think that's one of the biggest factors in consolidation on the operator side. And I think it's going to work out well. It's still going through a lot of pain. A lot of good folks still looking for something to do with their time. And figure out how to work the data to create more value. That is going to be what happens going forward.
Now, using your analogy of the balloon, because I think it's a good one to visualize. When we first started fracking, when this became a thing, the idea was, and I'm going to use to get those wings further out. So the idea was to get those fractures as far away from the wellbore as possible, trying to get as much of that oil, gas as humanly possible. But then over time, we realized that, hey, going too far away from the wellbore, we were subjecting ourselves to more of that pressure, that we were losing communication with the fingertips on those wingspans. So how about maybe instead of getting that balloon as wide as possible, let's keep it a little closer to the wellbore and almost pulverize the rock as close to the wellbore as possible, increase those recoveries. But are we increasing landings, or are we just creating a bigger pressure point to move through? So maybe instead of having those wingtips go all the way out, we keep them kind of tight and then drop an extra well nearby, or are we seeing some of that pressure loss? Like, what are some of those adjustments that we've seen on how we fracture the well and distance from the wellbore?
A great question. And I'm not a geophysicist, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. Okay, perfect. But the truth of the matter is, it all comes down to which rock you own, what type of rock we're in. The Permian being the traditional source rock sandstones, if you're gonna go in there and you're gonna get fluid to move, you got to keep it more. Think of more of a balloonist. Went blank on the guy, but the guy that makes the little animals out of balloons.
Let's call him balloon artist.
He wants to. The balloon artist, yes. He wants to keep the frac tight. I know I'm going to put 16 wells in this section. I have all the incentive in the world to get the maximum recovery out of that. I think that when you're looking at the frac tips and where the well is placed, if I own the section and then there's another operator to the section to the west, but we know they're still both good rock, I'm going to put my first well as close to their section as possible. Because the frac follows a path of least resistance. So therefore, we're going to go out there and try to recover as much from the section I may or may not own, but it also came out of my wellbore. Now, that sounds a little bit sinister, but the truth of the matter is it's finite amount of pressure. I want to stimulate this the best I can without falling below the bubble point and losing all of my reserves, or have the chance of getting fracked into. And it's a little bit of I better defend my house before I let my neighbor come in and take part of my stuff out of my fridge. And I think that we're still seeing the larger volume. It's all relative, but depending on where you're at, it's a lot more precise now in 2021 than it was in 2017, when service costs were very low before the big rip, and rock value is still all there. Most of what we're doing now is all infill drilling. So we know that if we run too hard at it, we're going to bash the parent and potentially limit the field for forever.
Now, you talked about the amount of water, sand that we've seen. A big increase in pressure, big increase in sand, but then it kind of tailed off a bit. I mean, when you look at some of the movements right now, have we gotten to a point where, we talk about EOG and the joke back in the day was they would, if it wasn't nailed down, they would try to put it down a well just to see what would happen. And at some point you put down so much sand, you essentially create cement. So you have to avoid a certain amount, but are we there yet? Or is there more that we can do to figure out pressure levels, sand levels, and kind of, not to be, is it fluid, in terms of what we're learning and the data we're pulling back?
It feels that way from the shale, is that we've reached the point of maximum return. We know that we can get 6,000 pounds per foot of sand down there, but your cementation factor goes to
Right.
1. So now it's no longer economic, and we turn an oil well into a gas well real quick, overstimulating. And I think that without seeing any recent pump schedules or what the current flavor of the day is that there is most likely, we've seen all the experimentation we're going to do, and we are transforming into the manufacturing space,
Right.
which is where you see some of your OFS leaders turning into what's our most environmentally sound way of getting this sand down hole. And I think that's the push of the industry is, okay, this is the new environment we're presented with. How much sand and water on an infill project will it take to maximize the revenue?
Right.
And that is but also, by the way, Mr. Vendor, I'm going to need you to do it a little bit cheaper so that my returns look better.
Always the case, right? Now, an interesting thing that we've seen more on a chemical side, where some different chemicals are being used to go downhole to either help pull the oil or whatnot off the rock, to create a bit more of lubrication to help or ease some of these movements. I mean, what have you seen some bigger adjustments from using different chemicals and different chemical mixes to accelerate or increase some of these recoveries? Because you see a lot of them being marketed, but are they just gimmicky? Is it just kind of snake oil, or is there real value with some of these chemicals and actually providing an uplift of 10, 15%?
As a former sales guy for a chemical company, I know that every product I had would increase production 30%. Now, the volume of that chemical that needed to make that happen was literally more than the earth underneath could hold in fluid-wise. They do work, but the amount of chemical that would need to be ran had a very little material impact on the actual production of the field. But I do think that there is some opportunity in the friction reduction space for when we're actually running downhole. We're doing a lot of the zipper frac, dual fracs, where we have one frac spread running 150 barrels a minute, trying to get 75 down 2 well bores. There is still opportunity there to get more value out of both operations.
Right. And that's a great segue, because it's something that we heard a lot about dual frac or simul frac, depending on whose nomenclature you're going to use. When back in beginning of 2020, it was being tested, figured out that you could use about 33% more horsepower, do it, frac both wells at the same time. And then as we went through 2020, guys were just looking for efficiency. They were trying to find a way to make this more efficient, cheaper, but still trying to maintain production, or at least limiting the decline curve. I mean, what kind of adoption rate are you seeing in the field of dual frac? And then how many basins do you think could actually tolerate a dual frac versus maybe, look, it's too deep, or the resource rock just can't handle it? What are some of your takes on that, both good and bad, on the dual frac side?
I think that there's definitely a real possibility that it could work everywhere. Just like in 14, our average pump, we'd get 10 to 12 hours a day of the frac company actually doing work. Something else was going on all the other time. And here in 2021, the average is 20 hours per day of pumping. And if the operator only has a single well on a pad, well, that's going to throw the economics off for the whole program, because I am limited in my ability to do work. And I think that when you're looking at the manufacturing mode that we're in now, that it's going to work better in the gas basins than it is the oil basins. For that very reason, is that you need to control the amount of fluid going through a perforation. We know it's going the path of least resistance, but we want to make sure that it's got enough in that path of least resistance. There's a well I can think of that it was a sleeve job that was a open hole completion, and you had to drop balls in a certain order to open those sleeves to allow the frac to stimulate. Well, if you get that order out of order, which is what happened, you can inadvertently put a lot of sand in one spot. There are wells that have 10 million pounds of sand in 6 perforations, and that well will never be economic. But it really does feel that there's some real value in stimulating 2 wells at one time, especially in the gas basins. If you're doing an infill project, you don't need the rate. You need the sand to allow the molecules to flow back to the wellbore. But I do see further adoption on it, further development of it, and I think that from the frac company perspective, the less times we have to move 18 to 30 trucks, it makes a lot of sense for both parties. How you control that flow at the wellbores themselves, that's another head scratcher.
And when you look at the way things have shifted, this also goes into the environmental side, where when you look at using field gas, we've heard a lot about biofuel, tri-fuel, and the adoption of using either field gas or some type of, even if it's fairly cleaned or coming back from the midstream. It seems like there's opportunity there. You're going to reduce your carbon footprint because you're going to burn natural gas instead of diesel. Is there an opportunity to expand that, or are we at a point where if you are not a biofuel, you're not going to get a job? Like, is everybody just already moved to that because it's the most efficient, most cost effective, to your point on cost, because you can just use field gas at this juncture?
It's always easy to be environmentally sound and conscious when the prices are where they're at now. You let oil rip to 100, we're going to end up with our same tier 2 diesels right back out on location. There was 450 frac spreads that were working 2019, and I think we're down to 200 and something today. I don't want to step on anybody's toes.
We're at 217 as of this week so far.
And then that means there's 230 that are no longer necessary. And the best way to power a frac spread would be to set up a natural gas generator and literally have electric motors that we can dial in very precisely. The cost of capital to transform these fleets to make that the reality in 2022, I wouldn't even put it in 2021. US Well, the guys with the been running the electric spreads the longest, they've got it dialed in now that would be, I don't want to alienate, everybody's working towards that goal. US Well's been doing it the longest that I know of, and they've been the most effective. They've climbed that learning curve mountain, and they have the least carbon intensive footprint of any frac company out there. And I think that if everybody had the choice and snapped their fingers, Halliburton would be all electric tomorrow. And so I think that the further adoption of that, it's all a function of the commodity price. And I believe that there's still some ability on, you don't want to talk about transforming old units into new units it's a new pump, but it still has 25,000 hours on it. Okay, it's mechanical equipment and it will fail. Just going up and down lease roads for its entire life is going to take a certain toll on it, regardless of the number of hours on the machine. So I do see that the path forward is either tier 4 diesel or natural gas blend. Wellhead gas is not, there's too much variability in it to make it an effective. I can't just go rig up on the well right next door. I have to catch it from the midstream. Well, then if I'm having to transport that gas from the midstream to my frac site, all of my carbon goodness that I put in is now gone away. So I did some stuff to take some really cool pictures about how green I am, but you didn't see that we had to drive all that gas to location, which would have been better with just a tier 4 diesel fleet to begin with, from a carbon consumption standpoint.
It's interesting, when you look at Caterpillar's earnings, which I'm always baffled at the things that aren't priced into the market. But Caterpillar, if you could go through the numbers, what they've done, they've been a big buyer into, I think, some of the electric side. And then you look at the tier 4, biofuel, the tier 4 backdrop. They're they're just selling out at this point, and you can see the conversion. And now, when you start getting to this point, like you said, there's 200 some odd spreads sitting in the yard. Well, how many of them are viable? How many of them, to your point, on a just efficiency level, maybe been stripped down, to keep the other assets running? That's when we're starting to get to this pivot point where guys are going to have to make decisions. How much is it going to cost me to bring labor? How much is it going to cost me to either rebuild, refurbish this horsepower to make this a viable spread? And I think we're starting to get into this turning point where this is the pivot point, which is why I do think we have a small pause here on new additions as guys are working with the E&Ps of like, how much can I actually charge you, or how much cost can I pass through? Because let's be fair, it's just going to be a pass through of cost, because pricing premiums are a little tough to come by. But there's going to be this moment in time where they're going to have to try to figure out kind of some of these other opportunities.
Absolutely. We are definitely at the inflection point, and it comes in from the capital. Mm-hmm. We'd all rebuild electric, brand new spreads, but hey, I can't work for what I'm working for an hour now, and be able to cover my debt service on building that new equipment. There's only 3 major service companies in the world that can cost to do that. And we've seen all this consolidation in the E&P space, but we still have 25 publicly traded fracturing companies that are working for cash flow, but it's not that they. A great question for you, and I'd like to find out what is if we shove or merge these companies together, just like Liberty with OneStim, their credit rating goes up, and now they can issue new debt and they can build new pumps. You've got a lot of the players that don't have the ability to hit the debt markets. They don't have the customer doesn't necessarily know what their commodity price is going to be, so they can't lock you into a contract for the next 18 months, because what if Chevron comes in here and wants to buy us? Why would I'd have to deal with this contract? And there's no financial incentive on either side to lock yourselves in with any one particular. The last time I saw a full contract that worked out great for both parties, both those companies filed bankruptcy in 2020. So we're at the point where we want to be good stewards, but we don't have the ability to due to market perception, is what it feels like. Now, if oil hits $100 at the end of the summer and it has reason to stay there, which I believe it very well could, maybe not 100, that there is you might see some of that come back into the fray. But as of right now, it doesn't make any sense for FTS International to go borrow $100 million to build 4 spreads that I'm going to get market rate for. At the end of the day, I can only charge so much per hour before it becomes uneconomic. And if the government wanted to step in and incentivize something, give them the tax credit, because they are pulling the molecules out of the ground to power the grid. But you have to have the ability to be the most green you can. And if the bank says, no, I have no other options. There's family funding offices don't want to invest in oil field service. It is historically a very poor return. And I don't see that changing, especially as the development of our oil fields falters.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point with Schlumberger and Liberty, because when you look at the deal, it was a great deal for both parties, especially Liberty. There was very little, if any, crossover in terms of client, in terms of basin exposure. So they essentially picked up working fleets with little or to no capacity. Obviously, there's always, what does the merge look like? You have different cultures. How do you get them together? But when you look at just the activation side, it made a lot of sense. And when you look at the activations going forward, I think there has to be a bit more of the adoption of some of the structures that are used in the international theater, which is, this is the floor, this is the ceiling, and the strike price in between is going to be dictated based on what is the price of said benchmark, whether it be Brent or Dubai or some amalgamation to come up with a pricing structure so that everybody wins. If the price of oil goes up, everybody takes a little bit of the pain as the price of oil comes down. And there's been some opportunities within that framework. one of the interesting times that in this go round is the value of NGLs and the value of liquids. You brought up Phillips and Chevron and some of their engineering capacity. And when you look at the splitters that they created when they were building things out and ways to make a heavier barrel of oil by stripping out some of those liquids, because with the view that at some point, and even at that point in time, the liquids had value. Now, when you take that to the next step and you look at the shortages that we have in PVC and plastics, and if you want to talk about the green revolution and the amount of plastic that is involved in that, the liquids market is going to be very strong and very healthy. So when you look at how some of this capacity gets used, I think you're going to see some of these spreads come back a bit faster, because everyone likes to look at WTI and quote WTI, even though there's 154 different blends of oil. 28 to 54 of them are the most actively traded, depending on the month. But at the same time, you have a lot of value that's buried in that condensate liquids NGL side. That is, I think, I know ethane, ethane recovery, ethane rejection is very easy to do within reason. So that usually ends up killing the NGL barrel. But when you look at LPG and you look at the adoption that, Asia specifically, when we talk about green and carbon reduction, the adoption of propane and natural gas has been revolutionary in terms of taking, the carbon out of the atmosphere. When you think about, what China's done on just subbing in natural gas for coal. So when you just start factoring this in, I think that there's a lot of value, even if we don't get to oil at 100, but oil at 60, and then the NGL basket at 21, there's a lot of money out there, and there's a lot of value out there. And I think that that's going to be an interesting dynamic, because before, NGLs were kind of like the throwaway. You just hope not to lose money. And now it's becoming the target.
Absolutely. Especially in this great state of Oklahoma, where we have 70% more liquids than we do pure heavy crude. Mm-hmm. And let me ask you a question. So my understanding is that the Phillips refineries along the coast is that they're made for that heavy Brent, the tar, mm-hmm. basically. And a lot of the reason, so we can all set our benchmark to Brent now because of the 2015 order, which allowed us to export oil.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah. The benefit with what we've done, and this was created because we were going to take Saudi crude and essentially the sludge that comes out of Mexico and Venezuela, was we had the ability we had coking capacity. So coking capacity just literally cooks it, for the most part, before it goes into the rest of the refining process. So a lot of these facilities were built to handle a crude slate from at about 31. Over time, that has drifted higher to about 33 to 34 API. But because we've had the advent of so much light sweet within the U.S., they've started to build excess capacity to avoid the coker. Because as I always describe, when you have heavy crude, that's like putting 1,000 carbon molecules into the coker, because each piece of the process steals its piece of carbon. Where that's on the heavy side. If you start with light sweet, you're putting 100, but you still are. Each part of the process is going to steal its carbon. So at the end of the process, the heavy is going to yield more products and better products at each stage than the light sweet. So the goal is you skip the coker by going through a different process, whether it's hydroskimming, whether it's reformer, whether it's some kind of alky unit or alkylation unit. And these are things that have been done on the coast because they want to make sure that they can still run that heavy, keep that slate on the on the lower end, take that higher crude and put it into other areas to create a gasoline cut and octane cut that is going to yield capital, some sort of return versus the heavy. And that's where the adjustments have. But you can only go so light or so on these coking sides, which is why they need to come up with a different structure. And we've done that, and we've invested capital. But that's also created an opportunity to export some of this excess because we still create too much or produce too much light sweet than what we can actually use, which is why that export market still remains healthy or a necessary component, as we will always have to import the heavier side or the heavier cut.
To make the fuel that our engines and our cars run. Now, we're sitting on these sweet NGLs, and then we're demanding that solar panels be built in the green revolution, and it turns out that they need our NGLs to be able to form those plastics. I know it's not illegal, but there is an EPA standard that doesn't allow us to make below-form plastics here in the United States due to pollution. And what I feel like that is being missed from this discussion is that we are literally pumping it out of the ground in Kingfisher, Oklahoma, and then shipping it to Taiwan, and then they're shipping it back to us in the form of plastics.
And
maybe there's a better use of this ability. And I don't know, the DuPont guys, the paint guys, they're big fans of our middle distillate. I believe it's a propane derivative and they build a lot of their products in, I think, Pennsylvania and maybe Canada as well. But they, we're looking at a global market when you could skip a couple of those steps, and then it feels like they're putting barriers in the way to allow us to be self-sufficient.
Right. Well, we've exported pollution and we've exported inflation for the last 40 years. I mean, that is really what we've done. We've taken anything that was a polluting nature and sent it to a place that has lower regulation, that has lower cost of labor, because it made sense to export the product, whether that be under LPG, other, light naphtha, heavy naphtha, or some, propylene, some sort of export that then would go, burn diesel to get there, turn around to come back as some form of plastics that would then go as a semi-finished good into the final product that used to be assembled here. Now it's assembled in Vietnam, China, some other areas to keep it local. And then we import the final product. Now, that is where things are going to change. That's why I think we've come to the end of the export of inflation. And that's where I think you're going to start to see supply chains adjusting. But we have to address what is greenwashing. We're almost, as long as we're not producing it here, then we don't really care if it's dirty. And I think we have to look at, cradle to grave. Just like they look at the energy sector and say cradle to grave, well, let's look at your stuff and do cradle to grave. Let's play this game and make it an even playing field to make sure that we're evaluating apples to apples. So, take that to your point on LPG derivatives going into the market. LPG is flying off the shelf. When you look at the shift between naphtha and LPG, you would run LPG versus naphtha, even though naphtha produces a healthier cut of products in the petchem facility. But we also have the bigger problem when you look at feedstock. So what do refiners make? They would make the stuff that goes in your cars and goes to pave roads, but it also goes into petchem. And if you look at how low the utilization rate is specifically in Asia, and it's unlikely you're going to see too much of a change given what China has done, we're going to have a lot of opportunities to export our product into these markets, especially on the LPG side and on the condensate side.
Yeah, absolutely. So if the United States all of a sudden became okay with child labor, we could build solar panels in the United States?
That's where the, what are the little hands, what can they get in terms of cobalt and the other types of silica and all those things? And that's where when you look at just the laws in general that are used within Africa and other parts of Asia, I think we have to be consistent with what are we dealing with in human rights. And what human rights matter. Like, we can't say that the Uyghur in Xinjiang matter, but then the child labor being used in the Congo to pull out cobalt is okay. we have to be consistent, and we have to look at that and really have a hard look at ourselves and the companies that we're buying from and hold them accountable, just like we're being held accountable to make sure that we're not polluting rivers and streams at levels that are just would be ridiculous.
Absolutely. If they change the laws, I got a little 10-year-old that would be a great dump truck driver. That's all I'm saying.
Well, before we let you go, one last thing that we wanted to talk about, when you think about making more money at the wellhead, we've heard a lot about Bitcoin. We've heard a lot about this crypto mining. There's generators that can use field gas. There's generators that can run at elevated BTUs. And could this become another stream of revenue? Because if I can say, look, you give me $1.35 per MMCF, I save a little bit of money on my gathering, my processing, what I'm giving up. So at the end of the day, I'm earning X. Instead, I don't have to go that far. You're right next door, and you can give me 30% of the upside. Is that something that is feasible in terms of what you're seeing? And could that be another revenue stream for some of these, not only just stripper wells, but also some of the newer wells coming on?
Absolutely. I see the further we don't have to export it, the better for everybody. So every midstream plant should have a cogeneration turbine or some way of manufacturing electrons right there with it, because we're still flaring gas in Texas, and then the freeze off made people shut the power off. And what? You're talking about the ability for electrons being created on the site. That I see that as being about the absolute has to be the path forward. The more efficient, the better. A cogeneration, and you have these tract neighborhoods that are sprawling most of the Midwest. Take the worst one in that lot, and that's our power facility. We put in a centralized pool, we put in centralized power. You get feedstock in Oklahoma, you get it from the local operator, but you get it from the midstream asset, and you get a guaranteed higher rate than what I have to deal with on the broad market. Right. Absolutely. Sign me up. Anything better, even if it was less than what the market could bear, a premium to what we're getting today. Right. You start talking about the carbon or tax credits and carbon credits for what they're going to charge us. They're going to put we're going to have a whole lot more orphaned wells than they ever intended to have to deal with a carbon tax scheme. Right. These wells, aging oil and gas wells, are barely economic even during the good times. So if I drilled a $15 million well in 2014 when it was $140 a barrel, it's making less than $100,000 a day now, right. And it still has that $15 million cost associated with right. it. Regardless of the economics, it's just that they're going to put us out of business if we don't tactfully control the discussion. Because you're going to kill the independent operator, and then we're importing energy once again from countries that don't have the same values that we right. do.
No, I 100% agree with that. So when you're looking at some of these opportunities, do you think crypto is one of those, or do you think it's something a little bit different from that?
Well, I personally don't invest in Bitcoins themselves. I will gladly provide electrons for someone that would like
exactly
crypto coins in their wallet.
I like it. All right. Well, is there anything that you want to leave us with before we let you get back to your day?
Hit me up I'm on LinkedIn. Adam Brazeal is the name there. I'm on Twitter as well. A little bit not as public, but if you know, you know. And we hope to continue down this path. And I appreciate everything you guys do over there at Primary Vision. Keep up the good work. We got to get you how to figure out wireline trucks too, because if you just see a frac pump moving down the road, it's worthless without someone poking holes in pipe.
Yep. Well, we're actually having a De La Rosa on, I think, 2 weeks from now.
He's going to make me sound silly. Good.
Well, trying to get that the service guys to have their day in the sun.
Have our day in the sun, man. We're out here in the flyover states. You guys wave at us as you go to the coast to coast, but we'd love to talk to you. It's a great discussion. We're very nice. Well,
then we can discuss on which barbecue is better. Is it Oklahoma or Texas? Because I know that there's a lot of passionate debates that occur on EFT all about it.
there's really no discussion, and you guys come across that Red River, and we'll show you how to do it on an American-made grill, Yoder. If I hear Traeger one more time, that is a private equity-backed decimation of the American economy, guys. I'm just saying.
Well, Adam, it was a pleasure. Thank you for your time. You can find him on LinkedIn. We'll provide that address. If you want to reach out. If he'll send us his email, we'll put that on so you can reach out if you'd like to learn more. So thanks again for watching. I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network.